Hello, everyone. Welcome to another segment of intellectual brainstorming and academic excellence. My name is David Oni, and my YouTube channel is David Oni Wiz. I want to use this medium to encourage everyone out there to come watch our YouTube channel called David Oni Wiz. You can drop your comments. You can also click on the notification button so that anytime we have a video, you'll be one of the first people that will be notified about the video. Um, if you notice these days or for the past few months or so, the world has been thrown into a kind of tension, and that tension is coming from the other side of the world, not in Africa per se, but in Eastern Europe. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So it's going to be um, a kind of lecture on the Ukraine Russian crisis, the Ukraine Russian crisis, so that you can be able to understand what is really going on, and you can be able to have your own opinion and have a first-hand information about this political ulubalu and economic you know um, uncertainty that has been degenerated as a result of the tension in this area. Now, before we dive into this topic, you know, issues and perspective on the Russian-Ukraine crisis, um, I'll try as much as possible to dive a bit down the memory lane so that I can bring you up to the current situation of things. Now, the Russian Federation, at its core today, was formerly called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, USSR. That was the name it was called in those days. Now, it was called the USSR in those days, and it was a large country at that time, even though it is one of the largest countries till today. But in those days, it was larger than what it is today. So it was called USSR, and you have a lot of political leaders that has governed or that have governed this country called Russia. Among them is the man called Gorbachev. You also have Tassa during the before the Russian Revolution, and you know the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic was made up of it was so big, and during the era of the Cold War, that is after the Second World War, there was a rivalry between this USSR and the United States of America. So there was a rivalry between them after the Second World War, and that rivalry was the era of the Cold War. They were not involved in what we call direct confrontation, but they almost went into war at that time. They almost went into war, the two of them. Don't forget to know that when you're talking about Russia, you're talking about the Eastern Europe, and when you're talking about the United States, you are talking about you know North America. So you can see North Pole and South Pole. There is a great distance between them. So the Cold War was there, and during the era of the Cold War, a lot of countries were, when two elephants are fighting, it is the grass that will suffer it. So a lot of countries were actually involved, and they were used as a battleground, you know, to to promote their ideologies because the United States was a capitalist country and Russia was not a capitalist country, it was a socialist country. So there was actually a rivalry between them, and because of this rivalry, a lot of countries were used as a base or basis for the promotion of their ideologies at that time. So during this era, you can talk about the Israeli war with the Arab states. You can talk about the Vietnam War. You can talk about the Korean War. You can talk about so many wars at that time in which these so two countries participated. And unfortunately for Russia, Russia was disintegrated in December 31, 1991. That was the era of the disintegration of the Soviet Socialist Republic. Now, when Russia was disintegrated, a lot of countries, fell out of the Russian state. They fell out of the Russian state. It now became what we call the Federation of Russia. So, among them is also Ukraine, because during that time, Ukraine was used as a base for stockpiling of what of nuclear weapon. But immediately the Russian state collapsed. You know, the that is USSR collapsed. Most of these countries, were separated from Russia, and they have their own self government at that time. But you know, Russia perceived most of these states as their spheres of influence because during the Second World War, after the Second World War, Russia came out what we call Warsaw Pact, and the Americans came up with what we call NATO. But unfortunately, Warsaw Pact has collapsed, or it's as not as strong as it used to be before. And you now have what NATO, having predominancy and supremacy over, you know, the Warsaw Pact. So with the collapse of Russia, socialism also collapsed in Russia. So with the collapse of Russia in 1991, socialism also what collapsed in Russia. And because socialism actually collapsed in Russia, that means the end of what of the Cold War. The Cold War came to an end at that time. Now, with the end of the Cold War and with the independence of these, states that were formerly under Russia, Russia still perceived them as what as their area of a space of a spheres of influence, sphere of influence. So sphere of influence. Now, what do you understand by sphere of influence? When you talk about sphere of influence, you are saying that Russia still perceives them as what as their satellite states. They still perceive them as what as their satellite states, even though they are no longer under Russia. Now, with NATO expanding, that is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization expanding, it was it was a threat, or it is seen as a threat to the Russians and some other states that were within that environment, most especially Russia. Now, with the expansion of NATO, NATO is led by the United States, like I said, and it has countries like Russia, I mean, countries like France, Britain, Canada, and some other countries. They are all under this NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So the NATO has always been what in Western Europe, but with NATO with its expansionist policy, most of these Balkan states, as they are being called, they are now most of them are, you know, they see it as that when they join NATO, they'll be more protected, and the spheres of influence by Russia will be reduced to the barest minimum. And that's why most of them are actually advocating to join NATO. Among them that wanted to join NATO is actually what we call the country called Ukraine. So Ukraine also wanted to join NATO. They wanted to join NATO, and by joining NATO, that means that Russia's sphere of influence will be reduced to what to the barest minimum. And don't forget that by joining NATO, that means that an attack on one NATO country is an attack on all the NATO countries member. So if you're a member of NATO and any country attacks you in any part of the world, it is seen or perceived that way that you are attacking all the countries that are members of NATO. So that is a great threat to the national security of Russia. And don't forget that Ukraine is not far away from Russia. So to the Russians, it is being seen that they are bringing the war front. I mean, they are bringing, you know, military encampment, that they are being surrounded or they are being encircled by the so-called Western countries, and they see this as a threat. And that if they allow this, there's every possibility that one day they are going to be attacked by NATO. Ordinarily, if you look at it in the area of what of military aspects, NATO, if combined, may not be able to face Russia. But there is a superpower in NATO, and that country is called the United States of America. And in the world now, United States of America is the strongest country in the world, militarily, politically, economically, socially. They are the strongest in the world. I've read the books on the rise and fall of empires, but it's like this empire is not ready to fall yet. It's not ready to fall yet. A lot of empires have come: Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, you know, the so many empires, just name them. They have all fallen at one particular time or the other. But this empire is not falling yet. So it is the strongest country in the world. So America being a member of NATO is seen as a threat, and America being a member of NATO means that all the various European countries are well protected. And if you notice one of my lectures, which I gave some time ago, I said that America's influence over the European countries is as a result of what? Of the Keynesian economic theory at that time. Because after the war effort, a lot of these European countries were indebted to the United States. They were so indebted because during the war effort, America was one giving them money, weapons, and the rest, they were selling to them. And after the war, a lot of them became so impoverished, they became so pauperized, they became so poor. So they looked outward to the Americans, so they gave them money. And it was not of about some years back that that money was actually being paid in full. And that makes them to what? To be docile or to follow the path of what? Of the Americans through NATO. And apart from that, militarily, Americans are very, very strong militarily. They budgeted a lot of billions of dollars every year into what? Into defense. So being a member of NATO as a country is a great advantage to all these countries. So single-handedly, NATO may not be able to handle what? Russia. Because Russia is a nuclear armed country. And when you talk about a nuclear armed country, you can imagine what happened during the time of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where the atomic bomb was actually dropped in this area. Until today, they are still having what the negative effect of what of that bomb that was dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In a single day, over 70,000 people died in just a single day. So you can imagine the megaton of what of the height of that atomic bomb or nuclear bomb that was used at that time compared to what to this period. You can imagine what will happen if this so-called superpowers go into what? Into war. So what we're saying here is that America NATO, I mean, for Ukraine to belong to NATO or attempt to join NATO is seen as what there's a threat to the Russians, because Ukraine is closer to where? To Russia. And by joining NATO, that means that the security of what of the Russians may not be guaranteed. And that is why in 2014 they started with what? With invading Crimea. They invaded Crimea. From there they started arming some separatists in Donbass to rise up against what the Ukrainian government. And that conflict is still going up till now. It's still ongoing in Donbass, in Ukraine. They're still fighting up to today. Now, for Russia to rise up now and say they want what, they don't want, Ukraine to join NATO. There's a very big reason for that, and I've explained it. That by joining NATO, their national security may not be guaranteed. So NATO itself is what is expanding all over the world. And don't forget also that the Americans have bases all over the whole world. They have bases all over the whole world. in any part of the world, they have bases. They have African command in what in Germany. They have bases in Germany itself. They have bases in what in South Korea, in Japan. In every part of the world, these guys are there because of their military strength. In Poland, they are there, and right now they are even sending soldiers to Poland. They are sending soldiers to Germany. They are sending soldiers to all over part of the world. They are the police of the world, and I credit them for that. I credit them for that for being the police of the world. Now, what are the effects of this war? Of recent now, the Russians are, they have upgraded their military status, and now they are doing what we call nuclear drill. Nuclear drill. That in war, you can expect the worst to happen. And if these two superpowers go into war, God knows what's going to happen to the world because they might use what the nuclear weapons against themselves, and the so-called allies among them too might be affected, and Africa too is going to be affected. Every part of the world is going to be affected because of this war. Now, also, don't forget that before this war, they have signed what we call the Non-Proliferation Nuclear Treaty. Non-Proliferation Nuclear Treaty. By the Non-Proliferation Nuclear Treaties means what they have to stop to limit the stockpiles of their nuclear weapons. They have to limit the stockpiles of their nuclear weapons. And till today, I think Americans they have left that nuclear non-proliferation treaty due to one issue or the other, as a result of the presidential system of election that was held in America. The Americans felt that the Russians actually would hijacked that election. They influenced that election, and that problem is still there till today. Now, these so-called superpowers, that is the Russians and the Americans, they have developed deadly weapons, and only God knows what's going to happen if these two superpowers go into war. Now, they in terms of war, there are so many weapons that are being used. You have fighter jets, F-35, fighter jets. You have the B-52, bomber. You have you know, um, multi-functional fighter jets. You have, F-22 Raptor by the Americans. They have F-35. They have F-16. They have Warthog. They have drones, Reaper drones, and the rest of them. Same thing with the Russians. They have all these weapons. You have warships. The Americans have about 10 um, aircraft carriers, warships that can carry aircraft about 250 or more than, they have about 10 of them. I think the Russians, they have only one for now, but the Americans, they have about 10 of that. That is a aircraft carrier, and they have their fleet commands and everything. They have intercontinental ballistic missile. And what do you understand by intercontinental ballistic missile? They are missiles that can travel from one continent to the other. Imagine what that one means. They have Scud missiles, they have intercontinental missiles, they have surface to air missiles, they have armored personnel carriers, they have tanks, Abraham tanks. You understand? The Russians, they have a T-34 tanks, you know. They have carriers, they have machine guns, they have regimental, uh, you know, armored carriers. They have what we call Osweisers. They have a lot of these weapons that you can never imagine. So you can imagine if these two guys go into war, the world is going to suffer. So I believe diplomacy will not, betray itself, because one of the reasons why the First World War, happened was because the world failed to take yield at the right time, and the war started. And you can imagine the numbers of people that actually there actually died because of that war. Now, after the First World War, or before that period of the end of the First World War, the world came together and said, let's have the League of Nations. Eventually, the League of Nations could not work as well. The Second World War happened. Now, after the war, now we have the emergence of the United Nations Organization in 1945 in San Francisco. That's October 24. That was when it was created. That is the United Nations Organization. And today, it has been able to prevent the outcome of war or wars, or reconciling people and using diplomacy as the last option before what going into war, full-fledged war. So I believe the United Nations is going to work out, in this regard. Like presently now, they are holding a security, council meeting in some part of the world now, that's being, right now, that the German Chancellor Schulz is talking, and NATO officials are also there, and some American officials are also there. But unfortunately, the Chinese and the Russians are not there. So the war is not going to, it's not going to be a good thing, and we pray it's not going to happen. Then, apart from that, the Russians have said that they are withdrawing their troops and everything away from that area, but satellite imageries and everything shows that they're rather building up. So, over 150,000 Russian soldiers are already at the border of Ukraine. You understand? Ukraine. Now, I would like to say this, that no country has the right to attack another country under the United Nations organization without any form of provocation. And apart from that, I believe that international communities, as a member of international community, you have the right to join any organization that you so wish to join. But in this case, it's a threat because by joining NATO, that means that NATO is at the backyard of what? Of Russia. And you know the implication of that. It may spare doom for what? For Russia. And that's why they are fighting for their life. Now, I believe that Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden will what? Will reason wisdom and use what diplomacy to solve this crisis because before it escalates into what? Into a full-fledged war. Now, war is not a good thing because in war, young men will always die, and old men will always do the talk. Old men will not go to war, to go and fight. And when there is a war, there's going to be what? Human displacement. There's going to be what? Destruction of human beings. There's going to be the destruction of what? Of the status quo, the destruction of what? Of those areas that war is going to take place, and people that are found there that will suffer the implication. You are going to have, refugees. You're going to have people dying, people being killed, because in law, I mean in war, the rules of war law, like the the conventional way of what of fighting war might not be used again. People would begin to take the law into their hands, and a lot of people are going to lose because of that war. So I believe the world can solve this problem. United Nations can solve this problem and solve it in good time before it escalates into what? Into a full-fledged war. So on this medium, we're going to end our lecture on perspectives of what on the issues of Ukraine and what and Russia, Ukraine and what and Russia. And we want to use this medium to encourage you all to subscribe to our channel. That is David Wiz on YouTube. Subscribe to this channel, and we promise you all to bring you a lot of interesting topics that you can never imagine, you can ever think of. Presently, very soon now, we're going to be going to international law and diplomacy. International law and diplomacy. I'm going to talk about what we call international law, give different definition of international law. What do we mean by international law? The various definition of international law. We're going to look at, you know, the various theories of international law. We're going to look at the naturalist, the positivist school. We're going to be look at what we call the eclectic school. We're going to look at what we call the neo-realist school. So you can imagine it's not going to be a dull moment. We're going to look at the theories of this international law and its diplomacy. You are going to enjoy it a lot because we're going to look at various definitions of what we call international law. What do you understand by international law? The law of the sea, the law of the air, the law of economic law, you know, the law of economic, the law of politics, and the rest of them. We're going to cover all this, and I promise you, we're going to enjoy it very, very well. On this note, I want to encourage you to subscribe to our channel, David Oniwe. Subscribe to this channel, click on the notification button, and also drop your comment on how to serve you better. To this end, we say a very big thank you to our eternal subscribers. And if you have not subscribed, please make sure you subscribe to this channel. Thank you very much. We will see you next time. Thank you and God bless. Bye bye.